Let me get this set up and we'll get started. Can you give me an idea of who you are? Like, who am I talking to? Just real quick. Just real quick. Like, what's your role? What are you doing?
I'm Gil Garcia. I'm a high school student.
Great. Awesome.
I'm Andrea Hampton. I'm one of the chaperones.
Okay.
In Grand Rapids,
Great that
Michigan.
you're here. I appreciate that.
I'm Katrina. I'm a first year life.
Student?
Maureen. I am an OG student at CSU at Colorado State.
Oh, okay.
I'm René. I'm a first year.
Okay.
I'm Courtney. I'm also a first year med student.
Okay. I skipped
I'm
you.
a second year medical
Okay.
student.
Just so everybody knows.
Zach, also an M1.
Okay. And one?
I'm Chuck Osterberry, and I'm a half-time biology professor and half-time pre-health advisor.
Great.
Hi, I'm Christian. I'm also a first year medical student.
Okay.
I'm Nikki. I'm a first year. I'm Victoria. Also a first year med.
Okay.
I'm Janice Mayer. I'm with the Red Cross, and I'm the Health and Disability Integration Advisor
Awesome.
for the central region of the U.S. for disaster.
Okay, wonderful. And to me, it's important because then I can sort of get a sense of who I'm speaking and who I might offend, or who I intend to offend. So let me just start with my own disclaimer about this. I don't usually start with a disclaimer, but I do have one this time. The information I'm going to present is really a bigger project. And with a group of people, we're sort of in the midst of writing a book. And when you get into those processes, what seems coherent to the writer very often does not seem to the audience. But, so I'm going to try and not cover absolutely everything that I want to put in a book. I just want to make sure that you get that. And so we may skip around some things. The second disclaimer that I have is really that the topic itself is not something that I alone should be speaking to. Normally, when we have these kinds of presentations, these kinds of conversations, the representatives of that we're speaking of should also be involved here. And my particular partner, my writing partner, who is a person that has a disability, wasn't able to be here today because there is a meeting of the National Council on Disability going on in Washington, D.C., and she is there, I'm here. So hopefully you didn't get the terrible part of the half of us. You did get the worst part, but not terrible. Okay. The third thing I want to say is just a little bit in terms of my biases. I started as a scientist, right, as a PhD prepared person, trained to be as objective, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that I've learned over time, particularly over this research, and I'll explain sort of the trajectory of that research, I've learned that, or at least my mind about this has changed, and that one of the obligations that really comes when one is witness to infringement of human rights is that you must speak up and you must be an activist, that there really isn't this sort of free choice to say, well, I'm a scientist and I'll remove myself from this information. So I do want to say that I do come to this session with a pretty particular activist perspective as an ally to people with disabilities and not as a representative of people with disabilities. Okay? I am an occupational therapist. I started my career, my professional life as such. And let me explain a little bit, since we're the two OTs here, we get the opportunity to advertise a little bit. It's a unique profession, and it's an interdisciplinary profession, really. But philosophically, it's very unique in the sense that we try to understand how it is that people do regular human life, and then walk alongside people with disabilities and helping them either re-engage that sense of regular life, meaningful life, or which is less common, unfortunately, and I'm one of the bigger critics of my own profession, of actually advocating for changes in the social world. So what I'm going to talk about today is a very strong tendency, and this is very much directed to all of us in health professions, particularly in medical professions, and particularly physicians. I'll be blunt about that we tend to look at life as a medical problem. And that as such, then, we create and perpetuate systems that view people with disabilities, which in fact are 15% of the world, right? 15% of the world has a disability, and that's the conservative figure, so that we in fact treat and think of 15% of the world as not normal. And that is part of the difficulty that might come about here. Okay? So that's a little bit of what I'm going to say. So the research started really very early, but my very first job outside of occupational therapy school was with United Nations, and I worked in Latin America. I was in the late 70s, the only occupational therapist for Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia. So that was a really interesting thing to do, kind of a crazy thing to do for somebody right out of school that hadn't really had a lot of experience. But what that did teach me, and particularly the projects that we were doing, were about incorporating a local explanatory model of health into the services that were being provided, right? So up to that point, particularly in mental health, which was the main area that I was working in, the models of care were Western, European, and American models. But that's not how people view mental health in itself around the world. So that was my first exposure to this. Over years, and the real beginnings of what I'll be presenting today, came about in the early 2002, that I had an opportunity to work with a university in Auckland, New Zealand, after New Zealand passed in their new constitution some provisions of restitution to people with disabilities, amongst several other groups of people that they were doing restitution towards, right? So it was a big campaign in that country to do restitution towards the Maori people. And in that process, they looked at a variety of populations that had been potentially shortchanged. And they didn't have, they wrote into the plans that supported that constitution that an occupational therapist with an earned PhD should be involved in this project. Well, they didn't have one, and I just lucked out, like happens a lot in my life. I just happened to be at a conference where the chairperson of the occupational therapy department at that university was, and we started chatting, and pretty soon I got signed up to be the consultant about this particular project. So it was really a human rights review of healthcare and community life in New Zealand, and particularly the description of how people with disabilities, a variety of disabilities, did their everyday life and participated in social life. Out of that, you know how things snowball, then have had other opportunities and have worked in several countries in this kind of process. The main information, it's not real data that I'm going to tell, it's more just what formed the information I'm going to talk about, came from three particular studies that we've been involved in the last 10 years. In the three of the projects, one was funded by the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, and it was a study that we did in documenting disabilities that were caused by torture for political prisoners in Latin America, particularly in South America. And that perspective really was about documenting and trying to figure out what was occurring with that particular population, and ultimately, which I will mention a little more about how disability is used as a way of political repression. And so causing disability is obviously comes from a particular worldview, and that was used that way. A second study came from the World Bank that was looking at migration patterns of people, particularly from Africa to Latin America. So you might get the sense right now that Latin America has really been where I've done most of my work. At any rate, so there's been a shift in patterns of migration in the last 10 years where it's not that everybody wants to come to the United States, as we tend to see in the news here, or have the sense that everybody's dying to come to the United States. In fact, very few people proportionally are permitted to come to the United States. They go other places. And so there's been this sort of shift in Western African migration to Western Latin America, South America in particular, and it had to do with world economy issues. They sold their cementification plants in Namibia in particular to a Chinese organization. The Chinese companies brought in workers from Saudi Arabia and other places, Philippines. So it displaced the local workers, and they were stuck with what they needed to do. And they were already working sort of on this rethinking of the life of people with disabilities and the participation in social life. And so those were in particular the people that ended migrating elsewhere in the world. And so countries in the western end of western side of South America were working on their own desalinification plans for water security in the world. And so they brought those folks in, but of course there was no sense immediately how to be ready for not just the very different cultural and everyday living patterns. Just because they knew about desalinification did not mean that they could adjust well to the coast of Latin America, or that the Latin Americans would even know how to work, negotiate this cross-cultural thing. So that was funded by the World Bank, and our job in that was specifically to describe, document the patterns of transition. And in particular, I worked with folks who had disability, had been identified with that. And then the third project was funded by the World Monetary Fund as a subsidy. So they support governments that are in the process of re-articulating constitutions. And so I was, at the time, was a participant in the United Nations Council on Disability as a delegate for a subcommittee, right? So the ambassadors there asked me to do this. So I was assigned as a person that happened to have the expertise in Latin America to work with this particular group that was working on the re-articulation of a new constitution in the country of Ecuador. And to this day now, Ecuador is the only, Ecuador, New Zealand, but Ecuador is specifically the only country in the world whose constitution specifically integrates explicit rights, human rights for people with disabilities. Aspirational, because the Constitution says so, the life on the ground is not yet quite there. But it is the only Constitution that has explicitly actually lived up to the United Nations public statements that I will talk about here. The second one is New Zealand, but theirs are not explicit to the language of disability, but clearly has included those as specific rights as protected individuals. The United States claims to have done it, but in the United States, it's really sort of this cloud statement of human rights for protected classes. And then you have to read other places and other places, and then, of course, people with disabilities, depending on what disability and where, would fall within that category of protected class. But it's not explicit, and hopefully you will see and maybe know that it's dependent on context, right? So I want to talk a little bit about the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is really the biggest, the broadest, and most explicit human rights convention. It was the very first one of this century. Of course, there were other conventions about human rights in the past, but this one was adopted after many, many years in 2006. So it followed really already some of the work that was going on in various countries, particularly the work in New Zealand. It was signed by 160 countries, and signing simply means, yes, we agree with these ideas. Since then, 161 have ratified, right? Ratification to this means that they say they agree and will actively work towards meeting the provisions. Okay? Out of those, the United States is not one of them. And let me see if I can catch this map up here. What the United States has done, and really we're looking at more global perspectives, let me put this here, is signed on to say that we meet, I think it's 8 of the provisions, so where the orange place there. So, but what you can see is sort of where the world is on incorporating the human rights treaties, particularly the convention, into law in the country. Okay. So signing and ratifying are two different things. Ratifying means that they really are incorporating them into explicit law. So there's some ways to go. I mentioned earlier there's 15% of people in the world have a disability. That's about 1 billion people. And that's, of course, the number of people that have participated in some form of census, in some way of designating this perspective. There are many people that are outside of many countries' census, as it is. So these are estimates and recognize potentially a low estimate. 80% of those 15% concentrate in the developing world or in the emerging South, or however you want to call it. So what that tells us is that disproportionately people with disabilities live in the poorest countries of the world. And that's really part of the biggest concern here. And therefore, they experience poor access to education, employment, healthcare, and so on. And that's part of why, in the context of any global health discussion, we should be considering what this really means for and how we're thinking about the lives of people who have chronic conditions or a long-term disability, which may not necessarily be ill health. This convention built on human rights, previous instruments of human rights, and where it was very different and continues to be different is that in itself it mandated a collaboration that is unprecedented in the work of human rights law, and that is a collaboration between the entities that might represent people with disabilities, the people with disabilities themselves, and the national government. So my particular job on a couple of the projects that I mentioned was essentially to review the activities that were linking these organizations. Were people, for example, with disabilities, and Ecuador was where I spent quite a bit of my work in the last 10 years, how have they actively been engaged? Who speaks for them, and who are they invited? How are they invited to participate? And it's very interesting, particularly in that country, because, which I'll talk a little bit about in the constellation of disability, part of the reason I think that it became a progressive country in terms of the rights of people with disabilities is that the person who was the vice president of the country had a disability. He is paraplegic. And it was an injury he had sustained later in life. And I think that had created a context, at least for him, as somebody in power, to be able to create some momentum. But it started out as this very sort of exclusive group speaking for the rights, and then little by little has moved down. So let me read a couple things, and we will move forward. Anyway, we'll keep going. I like to read this because it's a little bit of a ritual, at least for me, as a reminder, and I hope for you too. It has 50 articles. It's not a long read, a difficult read. We certainly won't go through every one, but this is what the intention of this convention is. It's a comprehensive and integral international convention to promote and protect the rights and dignity of persons with disabilities, and it will make a significant contribution to redressing the profound social disadvantage of persons with disabilities and promote their participation in the civil, political, economic, social, and cultural spheres with equal opportunities in both developing and developed countries. So as you can see, this really shifts, or if you're familiar with previous laws, it really shifts the focus to working and considering people with disabilities as full participants in a society, right? Not as objects of care, not as recipients of charity, but as real, equal participants. And that creates a little bit of a challenge for governments, for society as a whole, but also for people with disabilities. So what I want to share with you some of the other stories, which I'll do towards the end of our time, about how that might manifest in some of the countries that we've had an opportunity to visit around the world, or that colleagues have been able to contribute to this work. The claim essentially then is that rights are inalienable, universal, indivisible, interrelated, and interdependent. I don't think we will have time to cover all these. I do want to, as a main challenge today, to talk about some of the underlying causes that contribute to the denial of human rights to this particular population, or group of very diverse people, and present some insights that might be helpful across the world that have been provided. And as we go then to talk a little bit about how the various impairments might manifest in how people live out their human rights, and as well talk about some of the strategies that might be available to us as citizens. I put those in gray because it would take us a good amount of time to do justice to those. So you will only leave here with a gray appreciation of those two things. But explicitly what I want to talk about today is that for us, as people in the health professions or in the education of health professions, or really as providers of service to people with disabilities, is that we really need a global transformation. And it has, I think, to do with three areas. The one, as I mentioned earlier, is of advocacy, of really taking what we know and feeling responsible to make a change. It's not enough to describe. And in order to be conscientious advocates, there's a transformation that we need to have in the way we think about our own professions, how we approach research and evaluation, and then, of course, the terminology that we use, the language that we use. So, two articles I'll mention quickly for the context of the next few things that I say. Recognizing that disability is an evolving concept, and that disability results from the interaction between persons with impairments and attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. So that's an introduction that needs to be read with the second piece. Persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. So there's a lot of different perspectives that the work we've engaged in has specifically been looking at in terms of themes. And they're called often models of disability because they are telltale lenses that seem to organize the main services in laws in a country. Okay, so these happen to be the main ones that we've been working on identifying through analysis of policies, analysis of laws, constitutions, practices, models of delivery of service. There's a term that's often used that we're still playing with, like, and it's this notion of localizing global forces. and that in fact the changes in the last 25 years in the work and in the recognition of rights of people with disabilities has been a global force that has been transformed to local realities. As opposed to necessarily a local change that has caused a global force, right? That particularly beginning with the human rights, the various human rights conventions, especially this one, that there has been a tidal wave of change occurring. So that it's really about global forces and global influences trying to make local changes. So I want to go through those pretty quickly just so you get a sense of what those might be. In the United States, predominantly we have this individual model of care. The idea is, it's also known as the medical model, I'm sure you've all heard of that, where disability is matched with a problem, right? It's considered something problematic. There's a disease, there is something that's not working well, and then surrounding that problem are a whole bunch of professionals trying to solve it, right? And that the goal is to either make it go away or help the person live as though it doesn't have that problem, okay? And that many of our procedures, laws, and our ways in which we handle, and certainly in rehabilitation, we tend to have this idea that if you can't walk well, let's make you walk well. If you look like you have had a stroke, well, let's make you look like you didn't, right? And that the message behind that is that it's bad to look like you've had a stroke. It's bad to look like you're limping, right? And therefore, a person might internalize, and we do, which I'll mention later, that perspective, right? But the notion is that there's a problem, it tends to be a medical problem, and man, if we throw lots of resources at it, we will fix it, right? And so I mentioned rehabilitation in particular because that has been the growth of professions that essentially represent the failure of medicine, right? Medicine couldn't give you a pill or whatever, fix it, so let's throw in then all these rehabilitation people that will make it look like it's not there. And I'm criticizing my own profession, right? The world over, and particularly in the United States, people with disabilities who are activists articulate very often their disdain for professions like that. That although they've obtained lots of benefit, they've also received this residual lower caste sense of themselves because of that message. Criticisms obviously are that it really doesn't acknowledge the environment and things that might occur in the environment, and that, of course, as I mentioned, that the resources disproportionately are spent in technology in order to make that disability disappear. A social model is sort of on the other extreme, right? So the individual sort of medical model really started with the idea in laboratory science in the early 1900s that if you teased out a problem, a biological problem enough, you could find where it really was and then figure out how to fix that little piece, and then consequently it would reverberate, right? Well, of course, that didn't always happen. It has happened for many things. That's the truth, that for many diseases, that was the correct approach. Tuberculosis and all those things, it was great that there was that ability to reduce. The other extreme over the next century particularly with the civil rights movement, was this notion of a social model. That disability is the result not of as so much about a problem in the individual, but how the world around that person deals with it and socializes the person in itself. A disability is then seen as the barriers that are imposed on the person. So an easy way to think about that would be, for example, that somebody might not have mobility or easy mobility, and in order to access a building like this one, if there's no elevator, they'd have to go up all the stairs, and so that's where this institution has created that barrier because they weren't able to access this space. And so they can't participate because of this sort of contextual message. A problem with this, of course, is that there are many individual dimensions to the experience of disability that can be addressed, that maybe people want to change. And it assumes that people with disability are oppressed, which isn't always the case. And it's criticized often to have sort of this utopian perspective, and I'll mention a little of the sort of Russian perspective that comes across later, and that it's not achievable because it's so aspirational. And that's some of the criticism about that. A form of this social model that has come across in other parts of the world are several others, in this case minority groups. The idea that that people with disabilities are an identifiable, even though flexible, group of individuals. And therefore that they can advocate and we can think of them as sort of this shared set of specialty needs. Similar to what we would say and is criticized about dealing with Hispanics, for example, as one single group, or dealing with African Americans as a single group. And within that group, there's so much heterogeneity. But particularly in European countries, that's how the view of disability seems to have come across in terms of the protection of rights. It does rely on individual self-advocacy. So if you identify yourself of that group, then you might get services in a different way. But it also continues this sort of notion that disabled people are powerless or disadvantaged. Another very strong perspective that comes across because of the funding, a lot of NGO funding in healthcare throughout the world comes from Nordic countries. And this particular perspective says that it is interaction between the environment and the person, and that it's contextual. And therefore, it focuses the professional practice on this way in which services are delivered, not necessarily on changing the way in which laws in the country are provided. So the way in which we might see these is in the way in which access is provided to buildings or who gets access to what service, as opposed to changing potentially the perspective around why everybody should have access, or why that perspective might not be the best for maintenance of social participation. I'm going to skip a couple of these, but just know that there's a few more. This biopsychosocial is essentially what's considered universal. It's what the International Classification of Function and Disease uses. If you're familiar with that, with the World Health Organization, the ICF. It essentially argues that disability is a combination of impairments, activity limitations, and restrictions in the environment. And it really gets questioned mostly because it's been limited to the way in which health is viewed, not in which other parts of life might be viewed. This a particular perspective affirmative is one that's coming across in the U.S. particularly more, and in England, where there's a very active disability movement. In the United States, disability movement is sort of isolated to certain places, in particular groups, whereas in England, as an example, that's much more spread and even, to the point that universities in England, to be accredited, must have a disability studies program, as an example, where that isn't true in the United States, and so on. So let me skip, though, then to this notion of cultural defectology. Was a model, or is a model, that's used often in Eastern Europe to articulate and protect children, all the services for children in Ukraine and Eastern Russia and all those places, or Western Russia, I'm sorry, have to do with a way to guarantee that services would be provided. It came from sort of the social Marxist ideology. Vygotsky, if you're familiar with that, sort of linguist and philosopher, articulated this, and it really continues to run. And it's a way of assuring that children in particular will get services. But it has ended up with a substantially high rate of institutionalization as a way to guarantee service. And to also obviously problematizing specific conditions and guaranteeing a certain treatment for them. So for example, if a child is born with cerebral palsy, in those in countries that have this particular perspective, they will be guaranteed to receive a certain model of developmental care that's neurological, that's very physician-oriented, right? And those of us that work in occupational therapy and in these other areas know that there should be a social development, there should be all these other contextual things, right? We don't learn to move just because our body moves. We learn to move because I'm attracted to the pen that's here and I want to play with it. I'm hungry, so I see something over there. We do all these other kinds of things, but that this particular defect model is more specific to, your arm doesn't work, so let's have somebody move your arm 500 times to see if it gets better. And of course, there are positive things to it, right? It did provide care, but it has this other very tough piece of lifetime institutionalization. It has resulted on syndromes that we now call specific things that really came from this perspective. Attachment disorder, for example, that we know here, really has its roots on being described in the early 70s and 80s in orphanages in Eastern Europe. Out of all that have come two human rights approaches, and actually this is a little out of order, let me do this one first. So as a reaction to that sort of notion of saying to people that your life is determined by the disability that you have, that you're defined by this problem, there's been sort of this other movement across the world on the human rights approach. One category of these, it's called the human rights-based approach, is specific to the changes of laws in countries. But a different one that is more about practice-oriented is the way in which we might interact with people. It's called community-based rehabilitation. I hope many of you are familiar with that. It's an approach that says you need to work not only on the health needs of the person, or how you perceive that, but also specifically on education, on social development, access to health, social participation, so participation in the everyday life, and active contribution to social life. Right? So that many non-governmental organizations claim to subscribe to this. If they work on care of disability, they might be working on more than just, for example, providing clinical care. Right? The argument is that those professions that don't participate in that model then are actually contributing to maintaining a view that limits people's human rights. Therefore, this model, this convention can be considered a paradigm shift, because what it says is that we must, in all our professions, even if all we think we're doing is giving somebody a vaccine because they might be infected with a virus, that we would need to consider the context in which we are viewing that as a human problem and as a potential limitation of the person. Let's talk a little bit then about how culture really determines this. Because really, in order to even think of this sort of human rights aspirational kind of stuff, we need to think of how do we as individuals think about life, our own life. Okay? So let me move to a particular context that often is the beginning of this work. All of us participate into some forms of identity that we call social groups, right? So we might say we identify ourselves broadly as health professionals. Okay, that's a social group. As men, as women, as those variety of things, as high school students, as however we want to do that. But we all create, based on the culture that surrounds us, this sort of sense of identity that's based on multiple social groups that we might belong to, and they form our identity. So, for example, this is not a complete list, but certainly has to do with how we might want to review how we view the world, and is what we do often when we're doing the research on reviewing the language trends and relationships in policies in a country. Gender, the groups might be male, female, transgender, etc. I should have put etc. on all of them. Race, of course, as you see there, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, socioeconomic class, age, and ability. Ethnicity often in our country gets used as interchangeable with race, but that's not true in many parts of the world. And it's an odd, both of them are uncomfortable to some degree limitations. Okay? So but what we can do with this is sort of figure out what our own personal profile is. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to do that in a second. I'll give you my own example, right? So I identify in these particular groups. I'm male, I'm multiracial. My mother is an American, Swedish origin, Swedish-Irish origin. My father, one parent came from Spain, one parent is a national person from Ecuador. So I'm multiracial, heterosexual, Protestant in my case, middle class, middle-aged, soon to be old, I think, and able-bodied. Okay? So I want you to go through that very quickly and think of what your profile is. Okay? So if you consider then that this notion that privilege is also that something that comes to us by virtue of the social groups we belong to. Not by us individually, but by the social groups we might belong to. So that there's a tendency to gain access, privilege, rights, power, money, etc., education, based on our belonging to those groups. So for me, for example, if we look, so the areas, the categories that most often receive privileges over the others tend to be in the gender category: males, white, European origin, heterosexuals. This should probably say Christian. It depends on the context. The group I was working with when I did this was a local group, and they felt like in Omaha, Catholic had a higher privilege. Wealthy, of course. Owning class is probably a better term. Middle-aged in terms of the economic power, and of course able-bodied. Okay? So that if I were to overlap that with the group identities that I have, and that were happen to be listed there, I'd be able to say that 5 of those I match most likely the places that, or the groups that get the most privilege, right? And of course, probably male is the one that gives me the most privilege, right? And that just continues to be a reality in life here, right? I wonder how you see yourself. The point here is to illustrate, though, that people with disabilities are members of multiple groups, and that the likelihood of not being able to exercise one's human rights is greater the fewer groups one belongs to that have privilege. Okay? So that if somebody with a disability also happens to be old, poor, let's say Muslim in this case, gay, African American, or Hispanic, and female or transgender, that they would actually have a higher likelihood of not being able to participate fully in society, of having limitations created for them, and therefore their quote-unquote disability would be higher in the sense that the limitations imposed on them are greater. Oppression tends to be distributed by social group as well. So when there is suppression by gender, we call it sexism; by race, racism; by ethnicity, ethnocentrism; by sexual orientation, we tend to call it heterosexual because of the who has the power, right? Religion is specific to the particular group. So anti-Semitism, anti-Islam. By socioeconomic, we call it classism, ageism, and ability, obviously, ableism. Each form of these oppressions is perpetrated by a socialization process, and this is what our research has been trying to codify across the world. There's sort of this beginning, right? Somebody's born. You're born into this world with not a lot of mechanisms. You don't blame anybody for anything. There's no guilt. There's no shame. There's just you're just who you are. There's not necessarily an awareness of a history, prejudice, traditions, right? We all agree with that? Infant, baby, doesn't have a lot of these things, right? But then what happens is what we call this first socialization. So that immediately upon birth, you're put into a social context, right? And I would say, as a parallel thought to keep going, it depends on the model of disability, that if somebody is born with an impairment or a disability, or what we call a disability, that they will be socialized in a particular way, based on that view that that social context has about disability. And so here we would see that they're taught at a personal level by parents, teachers, or whoever the caregivers are close by, because they shape expectations, right? So I remember when my first child was born, I worked at Stanford at the time, at Stanford University, and I had a colleague that said to me, you got to get your kids to get themselves to sleep like within the first few months of birth, or you will have a problem. Right? And I'm holding my little baby, thinking, I can't let you cry. Like, that's so against the culture I came from, which is sort of more the Latin American, you hold your baby, right? But there was so strong this whole idea that you need to just let your kid cry. If they're fed, they just need to learn to pacify themselves, right? I had a very different perspective. My wife and I decided, no, we're just going to hold that kid until they stop crying, right? He's grown up. He's a lawyer. He works in civil service. I don't think there's been any problem, really. Ultimately, that we helped him every time he cried as a baby. At any rate, but do you see what I'm saying? There's sort of that perspective that we all come up with, right? And we all have these to some degree. The question is, to what degree do those limit participation of people that are around us? So we learn to behave that way, right? So if I'm probably likely that if I had made my kid sit in his bed and cry and fall asleep, eventually he would have fallen asleep out of exhaustion, right? But of course that would create his own interpretation of the world, which is nobody's going to take care of me. At least that's my fear as a parent, right? These perspectives then are reinforced by what we would call sort of the secondary or second phase socialization, because they're reinforced by the institutions that we become a part of. So they're extended family, school, other institutions, and so on, right? And they do that by various different behaviors: enforcing, sanctioning, stigmatizing, rewarding, punishing, privilege, and persecution. When I was a child, my parents believed that my preference was to use my left hand. Right? My father was one of the human rights commissioners for the United Nations in Latin America. And it was in the 60s and 70s when, of course, we were transitioning from military governments to democracy. And there were lots of attempts on his life and whatever the story. So they decided to send us to boarding school in Germany. So I was the youngest. My siblings and I went to this boarding school in Germany. And the rules there were that you had to use your right hand. So I was not permitted to do that. So that was an example. Every time I did that, I got whacked with the ruler. I had to hold my hand and they whacked me with the ruler. Okay? It's just to explain why I'm so weird. So I had a very weird, strange handwriting for a long time. It was huge. It was very difficult. I used to stick my tongue out to write. Something happened when I was actually in college that somehow finally it clicked and I decided I was right-handed and my handwriting, but it was really late in life. But anyway, the point is, it's that socialization process. But from a bigger level in terms of rights, then that's when we experienced empowerment or discrimination, right? Those things result in these senses of dissonance, silence, anger, guilt, collusion, ignorance, self-hatred, etc., that then fuel us as individuals either to feel satisfied with the world or dissatisfied, that causes some actions, right? So one of the things that we might do is do nothing, don't make waves, promote the status quo, particularly if we think it's normal. But that action then reinforces sort of the circle, right? Over and over and over. And in every place that this has been studied, and there's a huge amount of evidence about this, that people have an awareness of injustice and dissonance, but don't do anything about it because of fear. Very often it's fear based on this model, this idea of oppression that I want to get to before we end and have some questions. But there's an alternative, right, to make changes, and that has to do with raising consciousness, educating, taking stands, or advocating and questioning. And that is exactly what the Human Rights Convention has in its details that they want to promote, or we should be promoting. Raising questions, questioning why we do what we do, raising consciousness, investing in education, taking a stand, and therefore advocating. Each of these forms, I said, has a socialization process, and each of them has what we would call an agent or group or target, right? Agent would be the dominant, target would be the subordinate. Okay. So when we looked at this, for example, sexism, who would be the agent in general? Men, and the target, women, or transgender people. Racism, we can go through that, right? Whoever's dominant tends to be the lighter skinned in every part of the world, which is interesting. I was doing something in the Dominican Republic a few months ago, and of course I knew about this from other experience, but I hadn't seen it so blatantly that there's this very strong discrimination against Haitians, right, who are darker skinned. But the Dominicans that I saw doing it were very dark skinned themselves, but they just happened to be a couple hues lighter, right? And I think we do that all the time. You know, I, as a Hispanic, will often be told, "Oh, you don't look Hispanic. You're really not, because if I'm not tanned, I don't really, I look green, pale, weird." At any rate, so what we might say is that these sort of target groups, right? And that it's based on a negative stereotype. Most often, it's negative. And can be perpetuated in various levels: individual, by our individual actions, institutional, and cultural, as I mentioned. Forms of oppression, and we've got, I think, I can't remember, 10 more minutes. Okay. Vertical in the sense, obviously, that there's power from up to down, right? That the powerful people might oppress. But then there's this other dimension that is the part that I think that when we do research amongst ourselves as professionals, we realize we have, that is the main key, I think, for the change that we need to make. And that's this sort of agent-to-agent oppression, that we expect people to socialize a certain way. So if we're the same category for the same group, we do expect to behave similarly. And if you don't, then we think you're strange and we will exclude you in some way, shape, or form. There's target to target. That's the same also of people who are victims, right? That they will say, and this we see particularly in the work with the political dissidents that receive disability, that this notion of inflicting disability was a very quieting strategy. It was effective because it resulted then. It results in people stopping the resistance. And because of that, and that's why waterboarding and all those things are effective, right? That's the whole idea. You are threatening to cause disability. And so people say don't cause waves because it will affect all of us. That results, and I think these are the two pieces that are of particular care for us as health professionals that I think we need to involve. We need to think of this every time we interact with a patient. The idea of internalized dominance is that we become socialized to believe of ourselves as powerful people, or internalized subordination as of people without power, right? And there's lots of research that shouldn't be surprised that health professionals work in a hierarchy, right? That we're socialized that way. I see it all the time. And if I walk in a hospital and somebody says to me, Dr. Padilla, how are you? Then everybody assumes I'm a physician. And if I'm a male, nobody questions me, whatever, right? I could walk in and say, give this person 10 cc something, and somebody would probably do it, right? Because of that assumption that I'm a physician. But I'm not, right? But then people take advantage of that to some degree, right? We get used to this idea that how physicians direct the world. Many professions used to be called allied health. And in the 80s, we went through a major rebellion. In 1990, and it even happened on this campus, we said we don't want to be called allied health professions because, for example, an occupational therapist would be able to claim, I have worked on helping a person who had a stroke learn to move from being completely immobile to actually living a full life. And how many times has a physician actually done it, right? So the push is really for this idea of a team. But we get this idea of internalized dominance so that I'm the one telling my patient what you need. And internalized subordination, which is my belief that, I don't deserve much or I'm inferior and I really rely on that. Okay? So let me give you a few examples of that sort of idea from the research, and that's what we will end on. I think this is particularly remarkable. I was very surprised when we did this research. Myanmar, Burma, had already a policy in 1958 in their government that said that people with disabilities needed to be guaranteed equal employment. Really a model that we would say is perfect, or is wonderful, requires state-owned enterprises to employ a percentage of people with disabilities. And it was this form of guaranteeing full participation or equal participation. But what was interesting is that over the years, people with disabilities were seen as being afforded special, as the economies change. And in this notion of internalized views of oneself, people with disabilities did, some of them, enough for it to be look like a trend, become sort of demotivated and start not showing up for work. So there was a lot of cashing in the paycheck and not doing the work. And this in turn then led to this sort of perspective in that society that people with disabilities are not employable. And people will still even tell those stories. So when we did this research, we can still hear people telling that idea, right? And it's sort of an example of that trajectory of doing that. Anyway, let me skip to this notion then. When we are providing care, we want to consider if what we're doing is participating in deprivation of access or creating capability for access. Okay. I'm trying to see how I can summarize everything into a brilliant closure here, but it's not going to happen. When we're working with a person, we're going to have to have a sense of not just that immediate problem that presents, right, and what it is that's occurring, but really the long trajectory of where that person's headed. Okay. And this is really what the theme of this human rights movement is about. Social exclusion then results when we're not considering sort of that access and building of capability around the world. And we're seeing more and more of a trend in community-based, right? So healthcare is moving out to contexts, and this is true in 90% of the world, that now it needs to really be considering about education, stable income, employment. I just interviewed a person, that whole Zika virus thing that's going on. And I was talking to a public health person, and they were mounting, they're trying to fund this campaign that's going to do this huge education thing, and it's really very focused on using insect repellent. And so I asked this person, well, what are you going to do about helping people know that, when there's pooled water, it's more likely to have bugs there, right? And he said, well, yeah, that's a good idea, but somebody else will take care of it, right? So to me, in my mind, we're headed in a bunch of $1 million of helping the weak people make some more money, okay? At any rate, so let me stop there. There's lots else we could be talking about. But the notion would be then that if people have an intersection of these group identities, that they would be less likely to have social participation and be able to live up to their rights. And it's those multiple identities that we really need to attend to when we're providing care. That it's not just about disability, it's also about, is this a person that is of other groups who traditionally are excluded. Okay? I'm going to stop there because I think it's our time. I think it is. Any quick questions? Any comments? It is a lot. Yes?
I'm not sure if you know about, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where we're from, is that we have like a thing called Mary Free Bed, and that's very helpful to people that have been in like a car accident or whatever to rehabilitate. And then that's where as well, there's actually this team, I don't know if it's in Omaha or wherever, but there's actually a wheelchair softball team.
Right.
So we actually, granted we have to do things differently. It's also good that, there's sled hockey, wheelchair basketball, and all that other stuff. So some of the things, we just built in Grand Rapids Mary Free Bed YMCA, where it's like majority of the things are for people that have disabilities, but able bodies are also able to come to.
Exactly.
So it's like you can work out, but for the people with disabilities, but then
Right.
that next person that is an able body can work out with them and everything like that.
Right.
So
And those are really great examples, and I am familiar with some of them, of the activism that came from people with disabilities, right? That it wasn't activism that was given to people with disabilities or on behalf of, but those are those remarkable stories.
Yeah.
that we're talking about, and it's exactly what I mean.
Yeah, and for me, it's like I was telling him that it was like for me, it's like okay, for the majority of my life, I was an able-bodied person doing stand-up hockey, doing all this other stuff, and then May 11, I get hit with being diagnosed with MS, or just like that first couple of years, you're just like,
Right.
all right, what the heck do I have to do and whatnot? So
Well, and there's this whole other piece, and I don't know your story at all, but there's this whole other piece of when people become disabled later in life and their negative view of one's health, right? If they come with a social, cultural story of that being a problem, the view of one's health can be pretty destructive. I recently, and I'll stop with this, worked with a woman who was a judge who had a stroke and ended up with Tourette's, which is sort of, she's a very posed woman, but her mouth says the dirtiest things you can think of. And she was suicidal because for her, that whole idea of not being able to, and so there was some work that was needed in changing her context because everybody sees it that way. So anyway, we've got another group coming in here, and so
Thank you.
thank you. You're welcome.
Are you leaving?
I actually need to